Fun fact about Appy, actually, I actually knew Appy before I even met him. We used to run our databases at Airbnb, and we looked at who are the guys who use Airbnb the most, based out of Singapore. And Appy's name appeared up there at the top. He stayed one of the most amount. And so who is this guy? And sure enough, a few months later, I actually got to know him, and here we are today. Appy asked, how many of you guys have actually used Airbnb again? Quick show of hands. How many of you guys have actually know about the founder story, about the Airbeds and where it started? Okay, quite a few. I'm going to go very quickly into how the Airbnb started, and then quickly into how Airbnb has now impacted cities around the world. So the founding story. So Airbnb began by solving a problem. This wasn't a company that started by, with big business plans and so on. It started with a very simple thing. It's founded by three guys, Brian, Joe, and Nate. This is Brian and Joe's apartment back circa 2008. They have a very simple problem, the same problem that most of our users have around the world, which is they had to pay rent. This was in SF. They were out of a job. They had to pay rent. Turns out that weekend, there was an SF design conference. All the hotels were sold out. And they decided to host their space for travelers coming into SF for the design conference. So they wanted to set up a website and put up their space. The only problem they had was, look at the space there, lots of space, but no beds. They pulled out 3 Airbeds and blew them up and created a site at the point in time called Airbed and Breakfast. So this was Airbed and Breakfast, Airbnb, in 2008. This was the site and set up specifically for the event, asking people who are coming for the IDSA event, who we want to actually stay with them, and they will pay a certain amount of rent. Turns out the attendees, the people who actually stayed with them, were quite varied. They had a 32-year-old undergrad from India, a 35-year-old designer from Boston, and actually a 55-year-old father of 5 from Utah who stayed with them. They had a good time going to the conference. They were all designers. Joe and Brian showed them around San Francisco from a local lens. And at the end of it, they had enough money to pay the rent. They had extra 3 friends. And most importantly, they had a business idea to work on. They had to engage Nate. Brian and Joe were designers. At some point in time, when it comes to startups, you need a programmer. Nate was a former housemate of Joe, and they teamed up to start Airbnb. So this was 3 years ago, and how Airbnb started from Airbed. So where we are today. So we've come a bit of a way since the 2008 when there were 3 people staying in Airbeds. Some misalignment there. We have now 30 million guests around the world that have used Airbnb. Just 1 year ago, at the start of 2014, that's 10 million. There were 10 million guests at all time that have used Airbnb around the world. Today, at the start of 2015, it's 30 million guests. So quite some ways from the 3 guys that used to stay at Brian's place. Brian's place is still on Airbnb, by the way. They still stay in the same place. It's still the same apartment. And you can see that the early days from 2008. Sorry, you should read 2014 there. In the early days, 2008, a long lean spell. Somewhere along the way, they were actually selling cereals to keep the business afloat as well. So by creating a platform that allows people to list their space, one of the interesting things that has happened is that all types of inventory have come on board. Right? There's an eclectic choice, whether it's apartments in Norway or a castle. Right today, about 100 people are staying in castles around the world on Airbnb. We have castles in 42 countries. The kinds of inventory that come on board, we could never even imagine when Airbnb was started. It was thought of as a place where you could come and stay for a conference. Right? By opening as a platform and letting the crowd come in and list their space, people with extra tree houses in their backyard, people with castles or luxury villas. This one is is a seashell villa in Mexico. It's created an amazing way for people to travel the world and connect to unique travel experiences. Remember, this wasn't ever the intent. The intent was actually to pay rent at that point in time. But because of the platform, right, this has now enabled millions of people around the world to travel and experience locally. And most importantly, it's allowed hosts to be empowered around the world to rent out their space. At the background there is Nate, our co-founder, and this is Haruko. Haruko is one of our hosts. She's 75 years old in Tokyo. She doesn't speak much English, right? She's a retiree, but she hosts an extra space in her Tokyo apartment, and she's got 50 glowing reviews from around the world. So if you do a bit of a heat map of listings and places around the world, this is how it looks like. A bit less in Asia, you can see. We've got 1 million listings now, over 1 million listings around the world, in 35,000 cities and 190 over countries. Most recently, we added Cuba to the list. So it took a bit of work, but you now can book about 1,000 places in Cuba to stay. In Cuba, this is not a new idea, and there have been people who have been renting out their homes for years to tourists and travelers, and they don't have a hotel infrastructure there. But we have now made it formalized, and anyone on Airbnb can now go and book a place in Cuba. So the nice part about having all this growth is that we've been able to take a look at what's the impact on cities around the world. And we've done studies in 9 different cities where we have at a minimum of 3,000 to over 5,000 listings, to really look at what happens when people travel on Airbnb, what happens to the cities, what happens to the host communities in these cities. The first thing that we found is that guests stay longer and spend more. So one of the thinking about Airbnb is that you use Airbnb because it's cost-effective, it's economical. But what we find is that whatever savings they take from accommodation, they spend on businesses around the neighborhoods, and they also stay longer. So overall, actually, they spend longer and stay longer than the average tourist. 5 nights versus 2.8 nights on average. The other economic impact is that these are the money that the hosts make actually matters to them. This is not a business. These are things for them. This is income for them to actually stay in their homes. Right? 47% of hosts actually say that this allows them to pay their rent, pay their bills. The third interesting part about the economic impact is about distributed tourism. 76% of Airbnbs are actually outside the main tourist belt. So it's not in the Orchard Road type areas. It's outside the typical areas where you typically find hotels. And if you combine this fact with the fact that most of the travelers on home sharing platforms like Airbnb spend on their local neighborhoods, the benefits of tourism, the dollars that goes into buying services, food, restaurants, and so on, go to actually local mom and pop shops, go into the local economies, less to large corporations. And there's environmental impact as well. It's not difficult to imagine if you're staying in a home versus staying in a hotel where they are laundering your sheets, cleaning your bathrooms, changing the towels every day. There's a big difference in environmental impact. In Europe, when we looked at comparable hotels versus Airbnbs, it's in a range of 78% less energy and 48% less water use as well. And the third one is about social impact. And this one is not necessarily very obvious. It's about search capacity for events. If you think about large events like the World Cup, the Olympics, it doesn't make sense to create hotels just for events like this. Last year during the World Cup organizers came to us, and we worked together to provide accommodation for the World Cup in Brazil. It turns out that 1 in 6 people who travel into Brazil for the World Cup actually stayed in an Airbnb. At this event, Airbnb channeled about $38 million to local hosts in Brazil for the World Cup. That averages out to about $3,000 in that 40 days of competition on average per host. Now, imagine $3,000 for average Brazilian. That's a big impact for them. And because of this, we have recently just announced as well that we are going to be sponsoring the Rio Olympics next year. We are the official alternative accommodation for them. They realized that in 2016, they're not able to build up the same amount of hotels and so on. And this is another great way for both the city as well as travelers to benefit from a crowdsourced platform like Airbnb. Cool. I want to address also a little bit about now that we have all these facts about cities, one question that we always get is what about the rules and regulations? What about existing industries and so on? So it's not like any kind of industry, it's never necessarily a straightforward task to change rules. But what we've seen over the past years, a a lot of information has been shared with cities around the world. And we've seen rules being clarified towards the positive side in many different cities around the world. One example is Amsterdam. When Amsterdam first found out about Airbnb, they called us in and they were very, very angry with us. Right? They were wondering, what is this shady business? What's happening here? Why are hosts doing this? And why are travelers coming in and out of homes? We took our time. We worked with them to provide the facts and information. They did their own independent study about the impact of these travelers and the economy. And within 3 months, they actually turned around. And now Airbnb, they actually have their own short-term rental site advising how to sort of rent out their homes for travelers. In Amsterdam, as long as it's your own home, it's a home that you stay in, you can rent out for a certain number of days per year on Airbnb without any kind of requirements. Then in France, in March last year, they set up a rule. Across all of France, if it's your primary residence, you can actually rent it out without issue. If it's a secondary residence, that means it's an extra property that you have, it's subject to rules that's based on each of the provinces in France. And most recently in London, just February this year, similar theme to it. If it's your primary home, you can rent it out. It's not any different from hosting your friends and family. And they just set up the rules in February this year. So cities have embraced the concept. It's an ongoing process. So the question is, what about Asia? So I'll end on this slide. A couple of thoughts about Asia. One, we're pretty early days. You saw the heat map earlier. We're pretty early days in Asia. I think we're about 2 years behind what Europe and US is in terms of using a platform like Airbnb. But we're growing fast. Asia is the fastest growing part of our business today. And we've learned from our experiences in Europe and the US, and we've engaged cities around the world much earlier on this topic. So now it's a race between a couple of cities around the world, whether it's Seoul, Tokyo, Singapore, and Hong Kong, around which one gets on the list around setting up clear rules for short-term rentals. But the most interesting point about home sharing in Asia is really the fact that the impact of this in Asia is going to be very different and much more significant than in Europe and the US. In Europe and US, these guys get their rent and they pay their rent from using Airbnb. One interesting story that highlights the impact of Airbnb in Asia is one of our Cambodian hosts that we have in Phnom Penh. He rents out his home for just $39 a night. But with that $39 a night, he's able to send 3 of his siblings to school and pay for the rent for his home. Right? So the amount of impact that you have for like the same amount of dollars is very, very different compared to Europe and US, and it can go a long way. I didn't cover this, but the other thing that we also have is disaster recovery. Late last year or disaster relief. Late last year when the Malaysian floods happened, one of our hosts actually emailed us and said, like, hey, don't you guys have a system to sort of allow Airbnb hosts to rent their space for free? And sure enough, we did. We actually used it during Hurricane Sandy for people to volunteer their homes. We didn't have enough supply in Malaysia at that point in time, but when we sent out the notice that, like, if you're displaced from the floods in Malaysia, you can actually rent out a home. And we had about 30 to 40 hosts who actually volunteered their space and took in people on these platforms. Imagine if this is grown 3 times, 4 times from where it is today, and the kinds of natural disasters we have in the region. It could go a long way in this region. And that's it for my talk.
Great.
Thank you.
JJ, thank you.
Thank you.
Let's open up questions here.
Love your talk, and really impressed with the way Airbnb has seemed to successfully navigate the government policy space to facilitate their business. And I'm wondering, for the other people in the room, you've done really well. It sounds like other companies and other crowdsourcing initiatives are hitting walls with this. Maybe you could share a little insight on how you did that and what worked well for you.
There's been different learning stages for us. In the early days, it's been sort of like we had no idea. Government calls us up, we turn up, and we have no idea what they want and what's the challenge, right? Coming into Asia, we've had the experience of the US and Europe. One of the main things is really engage early with the regulators and the government. They're typically from typically the typical regulator is in the mode of, I've got a lot of work to do, and I don't want to regulate anymore. I don't want to have more checks and more stuff to do. And this is where there's a lot of thinking, joint thinking to work with them around figuring out like how it is a self-regulating platform by itself. Sharing with them the whole idea about reviews, what we do at the back end to sort of do risk profiling, what we do on the back end to sort of take off listings or prevent certain transactions from happening. If you're a user or you're a regulator and you go see the Airbnb site, this looks like a very simple, it's a pretty simple site, right? You go there, you search, you click, and you book. The reality is that at the back end of it, there's a lot of analytics. There's a whole ton of people. We have 200 people around the world on trust and safety. They look at potential fraudulent risk. They look at all the scoring, look at all the risk, and share this kind of information with them. So proactively engaging them and showing them a lot of this is the best way to go. And the best part about that is that like if any kind of issues happen, they get complaints from citizens or concerned people. They come to us and we work through a solution. The second part about this is actually working with competitors, actually. So we actually work with other sharing economy companies in the same space to jointly come up with solutions as a platform, as a community as well.
Hi, JJ. Nice to see you again.
Hi.
I guess just the toughest things you've had to deal with on 3 issues: cultural differences, taxation, and safety. So
I'll start with the other way around: safety, taxation, and then cultural issues. On safety side of things, I think the biggest part of it is not really the actual safety per se. The biggest part of it is actually it becomes a big barrier for people taking the first step. Right? What we find is like people who actually take the first step and book Airbnb and have a trip, they stay with us, right? They use their, not to EPI standards, right? But they use us for the next trip because they sort of figured out, I get it now. Like, I show up, I know how to get the keys and so on, and then build the trust from the first step. But the perception of safety becomes a big barrier of taking the first step, and that's where we have a lot of work to do around communicating what we do to make it safe, right? We've got over 30 different features to make it safe and what we have in the background. But it's a bit of a marketing challenge. Maybe we should crowdsource and find a solution for it. Around, the last thing you want to do about safety is telling people that you're a safe platform, right? Because the first thing they think about, like, oh wow, this guy's talking about safety. They think about what's not safe about it. So it's not an necessarily easy marketing challenge to do around, like, going out and telling people, like, here's all these features about safety is not the easiest way to sort of build trust. On the taxation piece, it's a city-by-city thing. We're working with different cities around the world. It's something that we've got to keep working at on a case-by-case basis. But the initial approach for all of this is that, like, we ask our hosts to remit any kind of taxes and any kind of like group-wide taxes or region-wide taxes that's reasonable for us. We work with the EU, for example, and we work with cities on hotel tax. But it's very complex, and we do it, city by city, and we've got to keep building it up over time. The last one is about cultural differences. I would say there is some level of risk averseness, I think, in Asia versus the rest of the world. But there's two elements to it that make it that counter it, right? From a host point of view, from a host side point of view, one thing we have in abundance in Asia is just the amount of people and help to actually host, right? In Europe, if you are hosting a place, you do the sheets, you clean everything. In Asia, if you're hosting a place, you have help, you have helper and so on. That makes the thing around like passing a key and so on a lot more seamless. So there's the cultural factors around like trust and so on, but it's somewhat balanced by the fact that like there's also a lot of less friction because you get help to do it. From a traveler point of view, this is not entirely different as well, right? We have different types of inventory in the region. For example, villas in Bali and in Phuket, vacation rental places, where this has some level of similarities to what the model actually is. So it's not too much of a jump to sort of go from, and also Asians travel with family, right? So they sort of get it like, okay, I get it. It's like staying in my aunt's home and so on.
If we look at Europe, we have some countries with quite economic problems today.
Yeah.
Do you see any patterns that the countries that today have quite difficult economically, are they more highly represented than other countries?
Yeah, that's a good question. We do think there's some effect of this, but it's quite hard to tell. We have a lot of listings and hosts, very good hosts in Spain and Italy, right? Is that because they are more friendly and they have actually a lot of good properties and a lot of good holiday vacation destinations? Or is it because of the economic situation? We think it's a mix of the two. Right? So Spain is one of our largest destinations in Europe, for example. And I think part of it is because of the weather, they have the space and places, but it's definitely some level of it is affected by the fact that like people actually need to get by given the economic circumstances. In the Nordics, for example, we do see that like the level of hosting may not necessarily be as strong because it's more social rather than economic needs to do it.
Although what I found something very interesting in Nordics, and this only happened to me in Nordics when I travel in Europe, is like when I rent an apartment or when I rent a room, the bedroom, the living room, they consider like as a bedroom. So when I show up there, I was like, is this the bedroom? So, yeah. So how do you work in those issues? Do you have any of those comments that people really make? Because
so we're doing a lot more to sort of educate hosts around, what's the required standards around hosting, around like what constitutes a room. Are you going to provide breakfast, cleaning, and so on? What's the level of cleanliness, and so on. But the inherent challenge of a marketplace or a crowdsourced platform is the level of variability, right? And that's where a lot of the, doing this by educating is one feature, one lever. But the other half of it is just really around our platform itself, right? So a bit like Google, we're trying to do a lot more in terms of matching you as a traveler and the host as someone who's receiving a traveler into knowing that. So if someone doesn't mind that living room stuff, we hopefully match that guy with that host. So rather than sort of saying we have one standard, everyone has to have a minimum set of criteria. We have a variability, but we make sure we have variability on the traveler side and match them in the right way as well. And that's an ongoing thing, right? There's very few precedents in the world of trying to match this people to people in the online space. The closest maybe are these matchmaking companies, online dating sites as well.
Yeah,
that's the closest precedent.
One more, and then we'll take a break.
What was the decision behind including hotels?
So the thing about once you start off as an open platform, you have to stick to your principles. Hotels can come on board. The platform makes for a horrible experience if you have a hotel that's anything larger than a certain number of size. We don't integrate with other hotel inventory systems. But if you are one guy, you have the room there and you list it on Airbnb, take the photos, and list it on Airbnb. We don't stop a hotel from doing that. Do they get booked? Almost never, right? And we don't encourage them to do it. But do some hotels come on board because they're looking for, trying to fill their inventory and so on? They do try. So occasionally you do see some of this. And this is where we are. I think our approach to this is trying to open up the market, getting more people to host such that like the good inventory of homes and so on come to the top of the list. And people who are looking for space don't need to book the hotel and can book what they're looking for. So it's an open platform, and we have to stick to it rather than sort of say like, hey, no, this is the rule. So the only rules that we have is really around what you show is what you provide in real life.
Great. JJ, I believe you're coming back for a panel.
Yeah.
There's a little gift from us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andy.
Looking forward. Yeah.